recording. Welcome to the second episode of the Unpick podcast with me, Kay, and my co-host S. This week in the UK, we reached the grim milestone of 100,000 COVID-related deaths, a point that we thought was incomprehensible only a few months ago. Today, we will be talking about what does this mean for our society. The phrase never again is something that's been associated with some of the worst periods of history. And this idea that, and this desire maybe, to not repeat the mistakes that led us to those points. Well, if from a year from now, the vaccine rollout is successful and COVID is gone, will we go back to society as it was? Or are there things that have been stretched and bent and broken and will never go back to where they were?
This is a good point for us to think of ahead and think of the future because we're really in the thick of things. There's a new variant, the vaccines are coming out. We're not sure if the vaccines are going to be effective. Maybe they will be, maybe they won't be. And I think it's now a really good point to think about the future whilst we are dealing with the present and we're also looking back at the past.
So just before we recorded, you talked about the fact that you talked about homeless people. And this really struck me because at the height of the pandemic, at the height of the lockdown, the government provided housing for all homeless people. And this is such a small example, well, a meaningful example of there will be a point when all the accommodation will not be available. And then homeless people will have to go back onto the streets. And that's one of those questions. Have we reached a point in society where we've said, actually, homelessness can be fixed? Or do we just go back to seeing homeless people again? I mean, if you live in London before the pandemic, you couldn't have gone 5 minutes in any direction without maybe seeing a homeless person. It's been months since most of us have seen a homeless person. And I think that's such a really good example of, do we just go back to the way things were? Do we just accept homelessness is a feature of life? Or has this taken us to a point where we feasibly seen homelessness can be fixed?
To your point as well, I think what the pandemic has done for a lot of us is allowed us to realize that before we were told these are existing problems that will always be with us.
Yeah.
The Bible says the sick will always be amongst us. And I think a lot of us have taken that to be fact when actually I disagree. I think that we're always going to have sick people, but we should always have good management practices.
Yeah.
And I remember when Jeremy Corbyn, I think, was it a couple of years ago, had said, let's have national Wi-Fi. Let's nationalize, how we deliver broadband to people. And people said, socialists take over, blah, blah, blah. But now when we realize that there are hundreds and thousands of children, young people, adults in our country who need the internet to study, to work, to learn. And suddenly it doesn't look like such a bad idea. Somehow we realize there is a solution for homelessness. But before, it was always taken to be, well, there's always going to be one or two people roaming around. It seems to me that when push comes to shove, there's some things that we can absolutely do. But I don't understand why it always has to be at the edge. The country's literally just about to drop off to the edge. Only then do we pull back and actually make, good decisions. And we actually seek to look after people. Because this is the first time I've heard from the top Tories talk about how much they supposedly love the NHS. They want to hug the NHS. The NHS is their best friend. Yet time after time after time, they vote over and over again to not expand funding or to expand privatization. We just recently learned that the government had voted to not protect the NHS from future trade deal agreements. These are the same people who came out a few months ago. Was it every Wednesday or Thursday?
Thursday.
Right, clapping like seals on the street because supposedly we care about the NHS. And I think what this pandemic has done is it has really uncovered everything about our society, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
It's interesting that one of the arguments given against doing anything is that you won't be able to eradicate problem X completely. Often what we're saying is we need a structural response to, for example, rough sleeping.
Right.
We accept that no solution will ever eradicate homelessness or rough sleeping completely. But why not do something that will eradicate it 90% or 95%? The imperfectness of a solution is not a reason not to do it. The broadband example is a great one. Ideas that previously we thought were beyond the pale not just seem feasible, but necessary.
And sensible.
Can you genuinely argue in 2021 that in modern Britain, everyone should not have access to broadband? Communication is the way of modernity. These are not luxuries. And often when you hear this debate, you hear things like transport, broadband, food, water, these things being classified as almost as luxuries. And this pandemic has told us these things are not luxuries. These things are fundamentals.
No, absolutely. And I think the scary other side of this, this idea of new ideas coming to the forefront is that we have shown that our tolerance to incompetence from our government is so high. It's too high. I've seen
Yeah,
interviews of people saying, well, there's no way Boris could have predicted this. There's no way anyone could have predicted this. There's no way we could have known. And the fact is, we did know. We could have predicted it. And I think that for a lot of people, the pandemic has been cover for, and not to be hyperbolic, but for nefarious things to happen.
yeah,
The PPE mismanagement, the scandal of all these contracts going to Matt Hancock's brother's son. They go to the same pub and are somehow part of the same WhatsApp group. So he gets 100 million, contract. And somehow because we're also focused on one, our personal survival, but
yeah.
also we're also focused on not dying and for the people around us. But I think the government is getting away with so much, and not just the British government, but the governments across the world. We've reached our 100,000 point of no return. America, are they on like 250?
400,000.
Oh,
I think
right.
that they're drawing to, or Biden said, expect 400,000 deaths soon.
Right. So they're coming up to 400,000 people dying is such a large number. It's so big. And globally, it's, millions of people infected, millions, hundreds and thousands of people dying. And this is not just the British government. We are not unique in that.
Just to correct it, I think Biden said we will be at 500,000 soon. So the New York
You're just making
Times,
it worse with your corrections.
the New York Times says there have been 437,000 deaths in America and 26 million cases so far.
Just take a minute to really think about that. 26 million people, 26 million people.
Yeah,
And I don't want to enter conspiracy theory realm, but I think a lot of countries around the world are not accurately reporting. America may be so, but I don't think a lot of countries around the world are accurately reporting their COVID
yeah.
infection rates and their death rates. So that is actually, these are conservative estimates. These are
Let-
not accurate
yeah.
estimates.
Let's pause on 26 million because this is something that's really pissed me off. When people talk about the percentage of people who've died as being a small amount, percentage of the overall number of cases, for each of these 26 million people who've contracted COVID, there would have been some cost to them, whether it was time lost at work, whether it would have been time lost at work for their friends and family who had to isolate, but also long COVID. And one of the
Mm,
things that we can't fully understand yet, but will absolutely be a
absolutely.
feature of public health policy and what happens to the millions of people who contracted COVID, survived, but haven't gone scot free because long COVID out here, long COVID is real.
Yeah,
And
and
I'm reading articles of people saying that they can't eat without throwing up because they've lost their sense of taste and smell. Got people who previously fit athletic people are
yes.
struggling to run a single mile when they were doing like marathons, but also the psychological and mental cost. Will our already under strain, overworked, overburdened health system be able to look after these people? Almost feels like we've got one public health crisis just waiting to go once COVID is done.
To make even that grim picture even worse, you said healthcare system. I think that mentally, at least for me, I don't think of human beings. I think
Yeah,
of infrastructure. I think of a building. I think of a
yeah,
hospital.
yeah,
But we already know that the exact same thing you're talking about, that's affected NHS
yeah,
healthcare professionals and workers. So it's not just the population who
yeah,
have long COVID, it's them. And I don't know if you watched, I think it was a few weeks ago, the BBC went into, was it St. George's Hospital in London?
right.
And they interviewed nurses and consultants, and this nurse, I think she said she just goes home and cries. She's been at the front lines for so long. There's a healthcare crisis for us as a population, and there's also a crisis coming up for the people who are helping us deal with that. Before COVID, we knew in this country we had an issue with loneliness. We knew we had an issue with mental health. Now there's this additional mental health burden of people who are socially isolated, don't have family or friends around
Yeah,
them, and then now, if they've got the disease and have to deal with that, and then also the trauma of seeing your father, your mother, your friend, your child, yourself go through this horrible disease. And for all those people who kept saying it's just like a flu, comparing it to the common cold and influenza, this is not a common cold. This is not influenza, because last time I got a cold, I was able to walk out of my bed as normal.
Yeah.
Like you said, there are people who have chronic fatigue, brain fog, which means that they may not be able to work, depending on what area you work in. If you have brain fog, you're not able to operate machinery or make high level decisions.
Yeah.
That means that you're
Yeah.
going to have to claim benefits. You're going to have to, get additional support to look after yourself and to look after your family. Just on the consequences of COVID and just the healthcare aspects, like you said, I think you accurately described it. It is another crisis looming. We're just about to deal with the vaccination, get everyone vaccinated, and then we don't even have time to take a breath, because then we then have to deal with long COVID.
One of the things we've been very lucky in the UK is our ability to essentially import labor, right? We are able to import nurses, import doctors. In the post-COVID world, or in the kind of the next phase of COVID, every single country in the world is going to be suffering and will need every single spare doctor nurse. So our ability to attract nurses and doctors to the UK, putting the kind of new immigration system to one side, will already be difficult. So it's not even as if there's a reserve of healthcare professionals somewhere. Wait, this is not like there will be no Windrush, right?
Mm,
A boat full of skilled, talented people turning up to save our system. Our system is already creaking, and but everyone else in the same boat. You and I are fans of Naomi Klein, and she talks about the shock doctrine, disaster capitalism.
yes. Excellent book.
And I was thinking the other day about how these crises create moments of opportunity that people capitalize on. But it doesn't just have to be the disaster capitalists. I feel like the public is looking for solutions, is open minded. So things like universal basic income. I feel like furlough has made the argument for universal basic income.
It has. Yeah.
Right? We talked about homelessness before. That's made the argument for state interventions in rough sleep. So I think we're in this delicately poised moment where we can either make a positive case for how society can be better, or we let the same pattern happen. People start attacking the NHS, making the case for privatization of the NHS. But we're in this really difficult position where, or rather, we're in this very crucial moment, will we as society learn, or to put it differently, what lesson will we learn from this crisis? That we need governments or we don't need governments? And what role should governments play in our daily lives?
Yeah, I think that's the central question, is about what does government have to offer us? And you talked about furlough being sort of a trial run for UBI, which is universal basic income. Also, people who flexible working. I know in the UK it's quite a common thing, but the
Yeah,
4-day work week. Suddenly we don't need to work as much as we used to. Somehow our productivity is now linked to happiness. I know for me, working from home was quite a new experience, because that's not something
yeah,
I usually did. And it's the small things like that, right? So it's the small things about, for example, our working arrangements and how we
yeah,
organize our life around, we're not able to get into work, transportation, all these small ideas. But the central idea is about, for those people who have an innate skepticism to government, which, by the way, everyone should, whether you're the left or the right, you should always have a skepticism as to how much of the government you want in your daily life. But for those people who, I feel their default reaction is to say the government has nothing positive to offer. I think this, how in the UK, how our government, and they've not handled it well, but I think the things that they've done well, the furlough scheme, I think there is a very strong case to be made about good governance and how that can improve our lives. A lot of things that have happened in the pandemic have been, in a way, a natural experiment
yeah,
for what we can do when we, post COVID, when we intentionally put in policies, right? So, for example, a simple one is a Wi-Fi thing. Having Wi-Fi access, and not just access to Wi-Fi. I know that's a code word for people who don't want to do anything. You have access to something, but you don't technically can't afford it. Like, I
yeah,
can walk into a Gucci store. Yes, technically I can, but I
yeah,
can't really access the goods within. We should have, no single person in this country, I don't care whether you live on a random island in the middle of nowhere or a village, should not have access to working broadband or Wi-Fi. There's something so simple. We can't downplay how big a role that plays into people's lives in their ability to stay connected, in their
Yeah.
abilities to seek services, to give services, to work.
It really blows my mind that we've been talking for decades now about the productivity problem in the UK. How the UK
Mhm.
as an economy is not as productive as other countries. This is a bit like being in the 19th century and arguing against the electrification of the UK. If you want your economy to grow, the people who talk about entrepreneurship all the time, who talk about wealth creators, and we know what that's a code for.
Hate that term.
In a modern world, it is in your economic interest as a country that everybody can share information, can start a business, can communicate, can get access to government services because everything's moving online. But especially in the COVID context, right? I just find it amazing. The same people who are against, for example, rolling up broadband and making broadband free are also saying, let's just shut away all the vulnerable people. Let's just have super shielding for the vulnerable people. Well, how will they gain the services? How will they stay in touch? How will we ensure that they're alive, let alone that they've got basic services?
Hmm.
We're definitely at a crossroad where we have to ask ourselves. Again, we're not saying for the whole world, right? Let's start with our own communities. In the country that I live in, what do I think every human being should have access to?
Hmm.
There is a thought experiment that says,
Is the veil of ignorance John Rawls?
yes, yes, yes. Do you want to explain it?
Yes. So John Rawls, modern day philosopher, and I say modern day because he wasn't like Nietzsche. So I think he was alive when like your grandparents were alive. Is my point. And he said, when you're thinking of how you build a society,
Yeah,
build it in such a way where as an individual, you do not mind whether you're the top, the middle, or the bottom,
yeah,
right? So if you think about it, you're in a room and you build this community, and then at random, you're placed at any position, any worker, if you're a worker, an owner, whatever, in that community, wherever you land, you're happy to be there. And not happy as in elated jumping on the street, but you have your basic needs met. So if you happen to be a street cleaner, that's okay because your basic needs are met. And actually, what that then leads you to do is to think about every single person as potentially you.
yeah,
And
yes,
hopefully, the aim is that you then build societies which are fair and equitable for every single person.
yeah. It's a really good thought experiment because if you were going to be dropped at random anywhere in this society you've created, people would start thinking differently about the society. I remember reading someone sort of trying to contextualize this thought experiment. They said, imagine there's a piece of cake and you and your friend need to share it equally. And what you do is one person cuts the cake, the other person picks first. If you're doing the cutting and the picking, well, okay, you're incentivized very differently. If you're doing the
Exactly.
cutting and someone else is picking, well, that's when you take out the spirit level, the laser cutter, the GPS
Everything,
coordinates.
everything, right.
You are going to
Hmm.
make sure that cake is
50-50, at a
right.
minimum.
And when people pretend that certain things in society don't give them an inherent advantage, talk about private schools. If you don't think it's that big of a big deal, why do you send your kids there? Why would you shell out all the money for it if you don't think it's an advantage? And people who pretend that certain things in society don't create an advantage must inherently know that they do. And these are just bad faith actors.
Absolutely. And to your point about, just going back to the John Rawls experiment, the veil of ignorance, for anyone who wants to look it up later, we've kind of had that with the pandemic because I remember at the beginning we were told if you're not an essential worker, stay home. And
Yeah,
guess who did not stay home? The
yeah,
cleaners, the
yeah,
nurses, yes, the doctors who, yes, they get their fair dues. If, we recognize
yeah,
doctors for their value, nurses. But what you found was street cleaners, people who work in Tesco, people who work in delivering our food, delivery workers, Uber Eats, Uber, all these small is not the word, all these people who before didn't get a look in, suddenly are essential workers.
yeah,
Suddenly we're lauding them, we're clapping for them, we're cheering them on. Why should that not continue post COVID? Suddenly everyone
yeah,
remembers, oh yeah, but anyone, and I always hear this, well, anyone can be a cleaner. Okay. How do you clean pure leather versus teak wood? How do you clean? Do
yeah,
you know do you know what chemicals you're not meant to mix? What concentration of bleach would you use to disinfect a kitchen versus a bathroom? Is it the same?
yeah,
Suddenly there's a level of skill. Previously, people didn't think there was a level of skill in cleaning. People didn't
Yeah.
think there was a level of skill in, like, for example, cleaning the streets. And yes, technically, it may not be degree level, but let's not forget you do need a level of skill. You do need a level of competency.
Yeah, and look, if all the cleaners went on strike for 2 weeks, I think you would notice. I
Hmm.
think you would notice if the people who collect our recycling and our waste went on strike, as they have done in the past. And I remember there was that big strike in Italy. You would
Yes.
notice. I remember I saw a really good meme the other day about I think it was a nurse at Tesco, um, and the cashier says something like, I don't know, and the cashier goes, cash or card, and she says, "Oh, I'm going to use all the claps," you know, because I've seen people saying thanking key workers, people want to clap for key workers, people eulogizing key workers.
Pay key workers. How about that?
Just give the key workers a pay rise. You can save yourself standing outside. You can save yourself having to awkwardly talk to your neighbors for 10 minutes on a Thursday evening. Just pay
People.
people better.
That's it.
And things like, what kind of society are we to to say we're grateful to the key workers for keeping our country going, for delivering our food, for growing our food, for keeping our trains and our public spaces safe, and then go back to underpaying them and undervaluing them?
Because we didn't value them in the first place, and we didn't value them when we were saying we valued them. Because the only way we can truly show people that we care about them and we value them in the way they should be is by doing the things that show that. I think the time for words is done, because this is the same Boris who said to us, I'm going to guide the country through this pandemic with people in mind, not the economy. It's going to be people focused.
Yeah.
And now, months later, we've got 100,000 people dead. And he's taking supposedly full responsibility, but he's not resigning. You know, it's really interesting to me. Everyone's taking full responsibility, but yet people, nothing's happening to them. Gavin Williams, is it Williams or Williamson? What's his name? The education.
Williamson. Williamson.
Right. So Gareth Williamson is taking full responsibility for the A-level scandal, but somehow he's still education minister. This is so baffling to me. You know, why are you still here?
You see in Japanese and South Korean corporate culture where
So they do
something
seppuku on YouTube.
and
I hear that story.
metaphorical seppuku,
Of course, yes.
where they go on television and they apologize and they bow and they resign, or there are some
Hmm.
consequences. And I think and it's not just, I think, politicians, but we have seen this detachment between actions and consequences. Whenever I see people not wearing masks, they're literally saying, I'm immune from cause and effect. When I see people not social distancing, when I see people gathering in groups, they are literally saying, I am somehow immune by the power of thought alone. What's that thing when you speak into existence? What's the phrase called?
I
Uh,
think it's literally called pray speaking into existence. Oh, you mean like it's like a miracle?
yeah.
Is it
No,
transfiguration?
no, the New York Times had an article about it. Manifesting. That's it.
Oh yes, yes.
You can't manifest COVID away. What does it mean to take responsibility for your actions? What do we as the public even expect? Will politicians across the world pay an electoral penalty? Will they suffer at the ballot box for the decisions they took in responding to COVID? And looking at the American election, the fact that 74 million people voted for Trump, despite, I think, I can say this, of all the world leaders, I think he took the least interest in this, but still got 74 million. There's no relationship between consequences and responsibility. What does it say about society if your leaders can mess up a public health pandemic, a public health crisis, and not suffer any consequences?
So to answer your question about will these leaders across the world pay a penalty for their mismanagement of the pandemic? And there's no short answer to that, because you have the press, you have these conspiracy theorists, you have people who purposely lie to the public about what COVID is. So essentially, what you're asking is, are people well informed enough to take these issues to the poll? And essentially, it's a question about public apathy. And the question that I'm always thinking is, has this pandemic really shaken people out of their apathy? Are people going to get more involved in their politics? And I hope so. I hope for every single person who came out and clapped on Thursdays, I hope that this is an issue that you take with you to the electoral poll. I hope that, every time you're watching the news about the effect this has had on healthcare workers and everyday people, I hope this is something that's helping you sign more petitions, get a little bit more involved, volunteer in your local community. But I think the role of misinformation cannot be downplayed.
Yeah.
Absolutely cannot be downplayed, because I think that they are kind of talking earlier about, different countries and how they report COVID. There are a lot of countries who I know for a fact are massively, massively underreporting it. And so the population don't even know that there is a pandemic, or they know there's something happening, but they don't know the true scale of the issue. So so these leaders may never pay for what they've done or not done, because the people just don't know, because they're purposely being misinformed. I mean, you talked about Trump being the world leader who did absolutely nothing. I mean, apart from telling people to drink bleach and, I don't know, stick a lamp down your throat.
Yeah, swallow a torch or something.
Right, but he has hundreds and thousands of people's deaths on his hands, and if his own people can't hold him accountable, no one can.
I mean, we spoke about the Capitol riots last week, but it's interesting just to see a week, 2 weeks later, you've got a terrible pandemic and a riot that led to the deaths of, I think we're still now counting 6, because 2 police officers have now died by suicide. And there's still people caping hard for him. There's still people, running interference. I love that phrase, by the way,
Mm.
running interference. I love sport metaphors or analogies. Is that a metaphor or an analogy?
I think it's a metaphor, because I don't think you physically can take interference and run with it. So I think that's a metaphor.
Something you said earlier, kind of how will this play out at the ballot box? Many millions of people for the first time have had to claim universal credit, have had to claim welfare, have had to claim benefits. I wonder how this will have
Mhm.
changed people's attitudes towards welfare, because we've had this narrative for a decade. Is it scroungers and strivers?
Basically, welfare queens. Yeah, it's it's Reagan's welfare.
George Osborne had that really famous vignette about people waking up early to go to work and looking across the street and seeing the curtains still drawn. Since when were
So you're this doesn't make sense. So you're busy enough to be getting up early and making your way to the train station, but yet not busy that you're still watching your
wait,
neighbors
and since
please.
when are curtains a proxy for your productivity? Or but this image of like this hardworking person leaving their house at 6:30, looks across the street and can somehow tell through shut curtains that these people are sleeping while simultaneously watching Jeremy Kyle on their flat screen TVs.
Right, right, and then texting their friends on their
Right.
smartphones. It's always a smart people hate people having smartphones. I don't know why, but yes, and I hope for the people who have had to go through the whole process, I hope that gives you a little bit of empathy into, for example, someone who's 65 has never, they're of a different age. Technology is so baffling to them. How they do it. You know, there was this massive. I remember when I think it was benefits that was completely moved to an
Yeah.
online system. And there was no empathy for the fact that there's hundreds and thousands of people in this country of a different generation who don't know how to use the internet. But at the same time, you're closing libraries, you're closing community centers, so people have no place to go. And I hope that we have all sort of grown more empathy throughout these past few months for what it's like for people who lose their jobs, don't know how to feed their families, for people in domestic abuse situations, for children who have in abusive
Yeah.
families or families where there's neglect, or their parents somehow just don't know how to help them with their homework. They need help for teachers. I know there's so much hate for teachers who get supposedly a 6 week holiday. Why should they not get a holiday?
Do you really want the people who are looking after your children to be overworked, overburdened, stressed out? Do you really want that?
Yeah, they do.
But it seems I just wonder whether people are just only sort of socialist during a crisis, and then once this is over, they'll go back to their old ways. Like with the vaccine, people are talking about people have no qualms about the government seizing the means of vaccine production.
Yeah, when Mark says it, when Corbyn says it, it's a problem. Right.
So you know how Americans talk about socialism and they talk about redistribution of wealth. In the NFL, the NBA, at the end of
Mhm.
the season, the worst performing team
Guess
goes
first pick.
first in the draft.
Yeah,
That is redistribution of wealth. You're
that's
that is isn't that a handout?
that's a
Aren't we
handout.
aren't we incentivizing bad performance?
So maybe next season you can get a step up, right? And maybe you could each get a chance to sell more t-shirts this time. So then that means the next time you're giving some cut of your money to the NFL league or whoever.
But I've never seen the billionaire owner of an NBA team saying, "No, I will not accept first pick in the draft because that is socialism and that's un-American and that's what's the phrase that Kelly Loeffler was using in Georgia? Radical.
Oh yeah.
There's a phrase she just kept saying over and over again.
I think it was radical socialist. What was radical? It was radical. It was socialist.
Radical socialist communist.
Definitely. I know. Radical communists were in there. She hates those. Those two were in there.
The radical. Oh, we're gonna have to Google this.
I'm googling it right now. Yes, the New York Mag. Uh, she kept repeating a radical liberal Raphael Warnock. She just kept saying that over and over again, as if she's Pavloving all her listeners. So when they
Yeah.
hear radical liberal, then they just put an X near her name. Um, but yes, I think what we're saying is that this pandemic has taken the covers from our eyes, hopefully, for
Yeah.
us to see that we have certain leaders in our country who do not have our best interests at heart. And hopefully the next time we have a general election, we are taking all those lessons that we've learned, because this pandemic is going to be here to stay with us for a long time. And so are its consequences, you know?
The challenge remains of how do you get people to vote in their best interests? There is definitely one class in society that votes in accordance with their interests, right? And that's the kind of wealthy 1%.
Hmm.
But you also have a lot of people in this country who just vote, in every country, who vote against their interests. And it's how do you stop people from falling for fake populists? There's a meme on Twitter that if you're not paying for something, then you're the product. If it's free and you can't see what's being sold, then you're the product.
It's you. Hmm.
All these apps that are free that allow you to kind of trade on the stock market with no fee
Yeah.
is because they sell your data to the big hedge funds.
Hmm.
And the hedge funds are able to execute their trades like trillion second before you do. But anyway, back on topic. Essentially, what as a result of this, a bit like with COVID, exposed a lot of things people didn't understand. What was
Hmm.
interesting was seeing people like Ted Cruz coming out and pretending to be populists and pretending to be with the people and
Absolutely.
railing against what had happened. It's like, oh, is that how you feel? Okay. Are you going to back whole scale regulation of the stock market? Are you going to back whole scale regulation of the financial sector? But
No.
no, you've seen a chance to hop on some bandwagon. A lot of people are taken by this. People like Elon Musk jumped on this. It's like, if you're on minimum wage, Elon Musk ain't your friend. Elon Musk will not allow unionization at his factories.
Wait, Elon Musk, the same guy who was peddling in COVID conspiracy so that California could then lift their worker ban and so that workers could go back to Tesla and make cars, whilst he stayed safe in his house, making sure he and his family are COVID safe.
These
No.
people are not your friends. They're able to switch from issue to issue as suits them, but these people are not your friends. There are always these rich champions of the little person that people just fall for. Elon Musk is not your friend.
No.
This guy was threatened to move his factory to Texas because California said, it's, and look, it's not as if we haven't seen wholesale factories in America. 600 people catch COVID, 1,000 people catch COVID.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a bit of a tangent to explain a really simple idea that a lot of people in the kind of wealthy class society are not your friends. These people do
Mhm.
not have the same interests as us. And just because you align on one issue does not mean that you align on a range of broader issues that matter to you.
Yeah, and I would say that people have to have a history of doing the right thing consistently across the board, right? I mean, I know in a couple of episodes earlier we talked about, real politic and
Yeah,
pragmatic politics, Yes, Joe Biden is not our right, he's not a left-wing lord and savior, but if he's doing a good thing, we can support that. When Boris agrees to finally feed the kids, we can say, good, feed the kids. That's a good thing. We can hopefully build on that. If someone is consistently going against everything that you believe, they don't agree with funding social care, if that's something you agree with. They don't agree with, for example, with building a civil society. They don't agree with social justice. Yes, that's a loaded term, but we all should believe in justice for
yeah.
society. Then you should be thinking, this is not someone who I really need to be paying attention to in terms of are their values aligned with mine?
In upcoming episodes, we'll really dig into some of the issues we've just scratched the surface of. A lot has happened already this year, and a lot happened last year. And there's some of these big thematic issues that we just need to spend a bit more time talking through. So, what is the state of our society? How do we address inequality, and how do we address some of the issues that affect all of us, regardless of who you are? Um, Maybe to kind of wrap up today, you talked about Biden.
Mm.
Thoughts on how he's doing so far?
So I have so many thoughts about Biden. I like that he has two dogs. I think that's hopeful. Also, talks of a cat coming in, which I'm looking forward to.
Don't you think it's so telling Trump didn't have a pet?
Yes, because animal sense evil. My mother has always said that. Animal sense evil. But I think so. So Biden. It's interesting to me that people are railing against Biden for essentially doing the same thing that Trump did for Obama, which is go in day one and try and undo as much of what the
Yeah,
previous government did. He has
yeah,
had, last time I checked, was 17 executive orders, literally most of them relating to COVID funding, COVID safety, face masks, how the federal government responds to that, executive orders on, for example, gender equality, the transgender
yeah.
ban of transgender individuals in the US Army. And so he's just gone in and said, you know what, I'm going to tidy up as much as I can. Is the executive order the best way to do it? No. And maybe this is something we can talk about in detail. Maybe we should have an America episode and really break down the three branches of government and how policy is made, et cetera, et cetera. But I think so far, so good. He has a lot of progressive things that he wants to do. I really, really liked his speech about racial justice and equality and having a focus on that. I know a lot of people out here do not believe that racial inequality is even a thing or know that it needs to be addressed. But it's really, really good to see him be very progressive in that. And I think far more progressive than even Obama was. And maybe Obama didn't want to be that guy and talk about black issues and racial issues. But
Yeah.
so far so good. And I think what we could do actually is do 100 days in office and maybe do an episode on that and we can go through what that looks like. But rejoining the World Health Organization, the Paris Accord, Paris Climate Agreement or Accord, I think it's good to see. It sets
Yeah.
a really good tone, and I think it
I
sends
s
a signal to the world.
Yeah, just quickly, I saw a headline or a thought piece or think piece. The Democrats need to act like they've won. And I think sometimes you just need to come with that energy because
Have to.
when Trump won, he took an axe to, his stated objective was to undo everything Obama did. And I think sometimes progressive, and again, asterisks, how progressive is Biden, but when progressive parties win, they sort of take this softly approach. It's like, no, you've won. Act like you've won because if there's one thing the right respects, it's authority and people who use the authority, right?
Right. I saw an interesting thing about conservatism and progressivism, and essentially what Mitch McConnell did in the past few years, Obama's last couple of years as well, was he just did nothing, right? And
Mm.
conservatism is about essentially preserving the supposed normal order of things. And I think as progressive people, we lose when we do nothing because doing nothing is essentially doing the work of the other side. I'm a big fan of that moving with that energy. You won, act like it. Clap back. I'm a big fan of these younger progressives who are on the Twitter, on the YouTubes and all the things the young kids are on, and they're clapping back. Every single time Ted Cruz tweets something, AOC is on his back. She's on his neck, telling him, reminding him that you brought people to kill me and my and your fellow, congressmen and congresswomen.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us to a bit of a venting session, but we've got some in-depth, detailed, researched episodes coming up. But until then, a lot of the episodes will be us sort of, venting, and this is therapy for both of us and for the listeners because a lot is happening, and sometimes you just need to talk about it without having a clear idea of where you're going. So our next episode will be in 2 weeks' time.
Yes, we tend to come out on Tuesdays, but that could change.
Follow us on the socials. So that's at unpick_podcast on Twitter.
That's right. It's the Unpick Podcast. Just Google the Unpick Podcast on Twitter. We are on all good podcast platforms. Even we have a YouTube channel. If your auntie wants to listen to it, I've got her on the
Yeah.
YouTube. You want to ask a political question? This is not a relationship podcast. We don't know how to help you with it. But you want to know, for example, quick summary, what's happening with the Keystone Pipeline. We can do a little explainer for you. Unpickpodcast@gmail.com.
Well, thank you for joining us at the Unpick podcast.
Yes, got it right.
Step 1, get the name right.
Exactly.
I've been Kay, I still am Kay and will be Kay, and I was joined by my co-host S.